We're in our third teaching in Kings and Crowns today. And in part one, there was a lot of history, a lot of the background relating to the rulers of Israel as tribes ruled by judges and their growing desire to have a king to be like the nations around them. And they found in Saul that they had a king that actually eventually was found to be deceitful and prideful and really not able to admit his mistakes. And it led to not only his downfall, but his family and his eventual ruling, the downfall of his family. In week 2, we saw that God had rejected Saul, but now was looking for a new king, and really was looking for a king that was after God's own heart. And we looked at the themes of that last week, as well as how to guard our hearts. And today is about choices, and they're choices that we all have. And we're going to frame them based on a couple different responses in 1 Samuel, since we're reading from 1 Samuel for these 4 weeks. And we're going to look at 2 knee-jerk responses. And it's chucking spears or gifting crowns. Okay, chucking spears or gifting crowns. And what we're going to see is that just like the accounts of the men in the text that we're reading about, our response to others is often a whole lot more about where we're at than what that person's about. And we're going to see that as we unpack this. So let's jump right into 1 Samuel 8, and we're going to start in 18. We're going to start in verse 5. 1 Samuel 18, starting in verse 5. Speaking of David, who we learned last week is going to be the future king, it says, "And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, 'Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, 'They've ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom?' And Saul eyed David from that day on. The next day a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had a spear in his hand. And Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, 'I will pin David to the wall.' But David evaded him twice." So we're going to start here with Saul and his spear-chucking habit. Okay, now maybe that song would have bugged me too, and you too, right? I mean, let's just be honest for a moment. Like if you hear a song that says like, "You've done good, but the young buck who's coming up has done twice as good, if not 10 times as good." Yeah, that would be not like on my playlist, right? Maybe David's, but I'd be like, well, I'm just going to skip that song. But there's a big difference between having a song, like that song might bug you, but you deal with it, right? Or even furthermore, you say, man, this young guy, I could support him because he's obviously gifted and has a future. But it's like, instead, he has this spear in his hand when he's hearing this thing, and it's just eating into him. And you deal with it, but he deals with it with a spear. It's kind of like thanking, have you ever been tempted to do this? You're thanking God for what you have until you walk out your door and look to your left or right and see what your neighbor has. And suddenly the great thing you are so grateful for pales in comparison because of that thing next door. It's this monster called envy that builds into our heart and takes root in our heart and compels us to do things like grab spears. He couldn't be content with the credit of thousands as long as he heard that somebody else had the credit of 10,000s. And you hear him saying, what next? He'll take over. He felt very threatened by David. Now we know that David was going to be the next king. We learned that last week, and that actually wasn't something that was spread through the kingdom. It was kind of done privately on the down low. God inspired, do you remember last week, God inspired this kind of private moment where he was anointed as future king, but it's not like everybody knew that. But Saul felt very threatened, and still he could have seen this young man, if you think about it, he could have seen this young man as somebody to cheer on, someone to rejoice with, someone to lift up and make a hero, really, if you're the king of a kingdom and one of your right-hand guys is doing this well, that honor is bestowed on you as well, isn't it? I mean, he's somebody who works with you and for you, but he just couldn't do it. He just couldn't be somebody who cheered on somebody else, because that would mean less spotlight for him. And do you notice the thing that blessed Saul about David is now making him throw a spear? See, David was somebody who came in and he played his lyre for Saul. And whenever Saul had like this harmful spirit on him, whenever he was vexed, whenever he was feeling oppressed, it says that David would come in and play like his worship songs, and like Saul would have this level head, and that spirit would leave and he would feel great. And now he's at a place where that thing that used to bring him joy in that person, now is the thing that makes him want to kill him and hurl a spear at him. He's just overtaken. And I want you to contrast this with another passage. And this is Saul's son, Jonathan. Now we're in 1 Samuel 18. We're going back to verses 1 through 4. And it says, as soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, this is David and Saul, as soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. That was the music thing. Like he wanted him to stay in the palace and live there. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. Now, Jonathan, it says from Scripture, they're pretty similar. Jonathan and David were pretty similar people. They're both mighty warriors. They're courageous. They're brilliant strategical minds. They both believed that God could and would deliver them as a people. And they became soul friends. They became deeply knit brothers. And they made this covenant with each other, which is, it's like a mutual promise to each other of serious, in other words, there's serious trust. So shouldn't that song bug Jonathan too? He's not even a lyric. Like, think about this. Saul, they're saying, hey, he's slain thousands, but David 10,000s. There's no like verse 2 where they say, and Jonathan did great stuff. Even though we know that there's plenty in Samuel that shows us all of the things that Jonathan did. He had many things that he could have had songs written about him as well. Not only that, he's the son of the king. He's the next guy. I mean, you know, in their lineage thinking, he's the next guy. And yet he's not even in these songs. Shouldn't the song bug Jonathan too? But his response to David isn't jealousy. His response to David isn't hatred. It's this generosity that's born of a couple things. It's born of contentment and a real confidence in who God was. I mean, to have a confidence that says, I don't need my royal robe that shows who I am. I can give it to my friend. I don't need my armor, my bow, my sword, or my belt. I can gift it all to my friend because I see who he is. I see where God's taking him. And I'd rather make a hero out of him and step back into the shadows. Yeah, there's no song about me. But my best friend's got a song about him, and he's my best friend. So in a sense, the song's about us all, as I lift him up and as I make a hero out of my buddy. So he gives all his royal stuff to him. It's this radical generosity. See, here's the difference. Saul felt diminished by David's greatness. And instead, Jonathan rejoiced in his greatness. He didn't feel diminished a bit. In fact, he probably felt bigger. It's why we love local sports. How many of you have played for the Seahawks? Not a one of you, right?
Surprise.
Yeah. I was hoping. I was like, oh, well, let's talk afterwards. But none of you have played for the Seahawks, right? How many of you have cheered and been excited when they did great things? Okay. How many of you had anything to do with that? Like nothing. I mean, afterwards they always, and we thank our fans, you know, for their support. Or it's just like if you've gone to a concert of a musician that you love, or you've gone to a showing of an artist you love, and you see their work and you rejoice in it, but it has nothing to do with you, and yet there's something that you're a part of it because you support it, you believe in it, right? You cheer it on. Jonathan, in a sense, had nothing that he would personally gain from giving everything to David, except that, in a sense, he did. Because what he was doing was fueling someone that he believed God was going to do great things through. And so Saul, he couldn't help but feel diminished by David, But Jonathan couldn't help but rejoice in David. Now I'm going to move on in the account, and if you're taking notes, you'll see a part that says loyalty, jealousy, escape plans, and target practice. And I'm recapping to help you because it's a huge passage. It's 1 Samuel 19, 1 through 10, and then 1 Samuel 20, verses 1 through 42. So instead of reading through there, I'm going to give you a recap, but those are in your notes, and you can go back later as you restudy or answer your study guide questions, and you can read through that passage. I'm going to give you a kind of a quick run through of that. This is what happens next. Remember, like David was almost pinned to the wall, and he escaped twice from this like spear chucking habit that the king has. So then Saul tells Jonathan and his attendants, he's like, now you guys, you need to kill David. So he's telling his own son, yeah, kill your buddy, and all his attendants, kill that guy. So Jonathan warns David like to be on his guard and go into hiding, and he does, and he has him go out and hide in this field. And meanwhile, he's going to go out there and stand in the field with his dad. Okay, and he's going to have a conversation with his dad, Saul, while David's hiding out there. So he does, and they talk, and he speaks really well to his dad about David. He's like, he's done nothing wrong to you. He's done nothing but support you. He's done great things for our kingdom. He's my friend. And he says, don't do wrong to David, you know. What he's done has been a great benefit to you. Why would you want to hurt him? And Saul kind of has this, okay, you're right. I see what you're saying. I pledge an oath to not kill David. Okay, is what he says. And then Saul leaves, and Jonathan calls David out. He tells him the whole conversation, make sure he understands. And he's like, cool, I can come back, to Saul like nothing happened. And there's another battle with the Philistines that breaks out, and David goes into that battle, and he does really well. And he comes home, and it happens again where Saul tries to pin him to the wall with his spear as he's playing his lyre. Like, it happens again, and David's like, I'm sorry, but like I should have seen this coming. I thought things were different, but they weren't. He escapes now, and he's like, I'm done. So then David flees, and he finds Jonathan. He says, what did I do? Like, what changed between our last conversation? Like, all I did was more good things for his kingdom. Why is he trying to kill me? And Jonathan's thinking, what? I just had this great conversation with my dad in the field. Maybe you got it wrong. He's like, no, I know what a spear, like whistling by my head, means. It's not like, welcome home, good job. Right? And he's like, and I've been here before. So Jonathan's upset, and David tells him to the point, he says, there's only a step between me and death. Saying, I don't think you realize, like, the weight of what's on my heart right now. This is my life at stake, and I've got to go. I've got to leave. So they agree on this play where David's going to hide in that field again, and it's coming up. There's this feast because of the new moon, and David has a spot at King Saul's table. He should be there. He's obviously doesn't want to go. So he hides in that same field, and here's a little play. He says, okay, you go to the dinner, Jonathan, and you tell him, since my family lineage is from Bethlehem, tell him I went back home because of a feast, like, a sacrifice that they're making on behalf of my lineage, kind of make this story and see what he does. Like, if he says, that's great, I'm glad that he went home and did that, then we know that maybe things are cool. If he freaks out on you, we know that he wants to kill me. Okay, and that was their little thing. And then he's going to stay out in this field hiding. And Jonathan, they have this whole little like thing set up. I mean, if this isn't two guys like making their little plan, I'm going to go out later for target practice once I find out what my dad says. And I'm going to shoot arrows out in the field. And I'll have a young servant boy with me. And if I tell him, hey, the arrows are back a little bit, then you're safe. But if I tell him, oh, the arrows I shot are beyond you, go get them, you're in danger. And that was their little plan, okay, on how things would work. So David goes and he hides, and Jonathan goes to the feast. And Saul does freak out. He's like, where's David? And he tells him where he is. And Saul calls him a son of a perverse and rebellious woman. Like, this is the family conversation at the table. Okay, and he tells him David must die. And Jonathan says, like, why? What has he done? So now Saul chucks a spear at Jonathan too. So now Jonathan's really getting the picture of what's going on. And this is the best Captain Obvious quote ever. It says, then Jonathan knew that his father intended to kill David. Yeah, if a spear's coming your way, you're like, okay, I think David was not exaggerating about my dad. So in the morning, he goes into the field, he shoots his arrows, he sends the boy out, says, isn't the arrow beyond you? and David's hiding, and he's seeing it happen. He's like, okay. What that means for him is that him and his best friend will never be together again, that he's going to have to go into hiding so that his life can be spared until Saul's gone, because he knows he's the future king, and basically he has to live in exile until that can happen. So when he sees that arrow shot and he hears his friend saying, it's beyond you, I'm sure that just crushing weight, that this anger and this envy has driven him from his home, from his future kingdom, and honestly from his best friend. It says that like they were knit at the soul. And so Jonathan sends that boy home after he gets the arrows, and David comes out, and he bows before Jonathan 3 times with his face to the ground, like this deep, it's a show of deep honor to him. And then they weep together, because it's not only devastating, but their friendship is basically broken and done with. I mean, it's together in spirit, but never together again. And it says that they wept and hugged, but that David wept the most. Such deep loss. He knows what he's missing in his best friend. And they say, go in peace, because we've sworn friendship between each other. And it says, the Lord is witness between you and me, and this is from Jonathan, between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever. And so in this heartbreaking yet like really touching account, what we see is that Jonathan is committed to David's success and his desire to see David flourish still through all this. All he wants is to see his best friend flourish and succeed, even if it eventually means his own kingdom. I mean, when he's sending him off, what he's saying is like, my future is different, and it's really kind of your future now, and I'm good with it. I'm good with it. And so your success will be mine, because I'm handing my future and knowing that God has put it in your hands. Now, I can't imagine, we got to shift to us for a little bit here. I can't imagine me or many of you hurling spears at people. Like you don't look like spear hurling people. Well, a couple of you do. But most of us, like, that's not us, right? Like, I hope you don't have a spear at home that's ready for whenever the occasion rises. But I do know that I'm sure many of us battle or have battled with envy, right? And jealousy just the same. And so I'd like to look at there's a progression that can happen in our hearts from spears to crowns, from chucking spears to gifting crowns that could truly happen. And so we're shifting to the second part now, which is the journey from envying others to empowering others. From envying others to empowering others. It's from spears to crowns. And where it begins is a heart that's truly at peace. It's a heart that's at rest. So the first place in this journey is number 1, which is a heart at peace finds its identity in Jesus. A heart that's at peace finds its identity in Jesus. Proverbs 14:30 reads to us that a heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones. And a heart at peace gives life to the body. A heart at peace is a heart that isn't threatened by other success. It isn't threatened by envy. Envy rots the bones because it's threatened by somebody else. But this kind of peace, the good news is that if we follow Jesus, this is the root of the gospel, is a heart that's finally at peace. It's the reality of the gospel that we're free. That this peace comes from knowing that we're children of God, so we finally can be free from fear. In fact, if you read on what Paul wrote to the early Christians in Rome, it's in Romans 8:14 through 16. It says that those who are led by the Spirit of God are the children of God. The Spirit you received does not make you slaves, so that you live in fear again. Rather, the Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship. And by him we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. So that fearful spirit that must compare, that must become envious of others, it finds its adversary finally in the adopting heart of God. That's where it finds its adversary. Why? Think about it. If we're adopted by the King, we have all we need. If you're adopted by, do you remember Annie? Remember that story, Annie? It was a movie, musical, play. It's been many things. And it's Daddy Warbucks, and he adopts this little Annie. And there's some conflict and tension and resolve. But what I always think about is that little gal walking into this place that has everything. And feeling like, okay, like all the things that could ever bring my heart fear really don't have much of a place in something like this. Now I want you to magnify that, because we're not talking about Daddy Warbucks. We're talking about Abba Father. We're talking about somebody who spun the world into being with his words. We're talking about somebody who, when you were being knit in the womb, he was fashioning you and thinking about you and creating plans for you. We're talking about somebody who creates beautiful things like mountains and oceans, and with the same power creates things like ants, and then for our pleasure creates things like dogs, and for our testing and patience creates things like cats. But this is the Lord. This is what God the Father can do. And so if we've been adopted as sons and daughters, think of the contentment that brings. That the one who everything is in his hands, and things like gold that we care so much about are nothing to him. They pave our eternity. They're nothing. This is our God. You want to talk about the adversary of envy? This is it. You've been adopted, and your dad's the best. And in his presence, there's no fear. In his presence, there's fullness of joy. Man, our hearts are finally content because we found a home that brings security to our heart. So we're adopted by the King. There's a second thought about that, why that should kill envy. And it's this, that adoption, it's a beautiful picture because it means this: he sought you out. Adoption's a beautiful picture. In fact, Darren and Erica, they've been working on a process. Many of you know the Montgomerys, and they've been for months working on a process of adopting a girl from Bulgaria. They get to travel this week to finally meet her. Adoption's so powerful because it means I chose you, and I'll do all that I can to get to you and find you and make you mine. And so, man, what a heart of contentment that brings us when we know that when God wasn't even on our radar, and no matter where we were, that we were on his mind and he was seeking us out to choose us. A heart at peace finds identity in Jesus. Secondly, from there, and remember, this is a progression. So first, like our identity in Jesus, it gives us this heart of peace, right? A heart that's at peace. Now our identity in Jesus, it fuels this contentment. If you look at 1 Timothy 6, 3-7, these are words that Paul is teaching this young new teacher. And he says, if anyone teaches a different doctrine and does not agree with the sound words of our Lord Jesus Christ and the teaching that accords with godliness, he's puffed up with conceit, and he understands nothing. He has an unhealthy craving for controversy and for quarrels about words, which produce envy, dissension, slander, evil suspicions, and constant friction among people who are depraved in mind and deprived of the truth, imagining that godliness is a means of gain. But godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. Man, look at what Scripture says that ungodly teaching does. It craves controversy. It wants to quarrel. It wants to produce envy and cause friction among people. And it says that this kind of thinking, they think that godliness is a way to get stuff. That by being godly, I can get stuff, I can have more. But you see that this kind of thinking, and if you look back through our history, you see that this kind of thinking, it produces all kinds of sicknesses in the church, doesn't it? When we think that somehow our godliness is how we're going to get more and more on this earth. And it really turns our envy on each other. But our identity in Jesus, it fuels true contentment. It says, godliness with contentment is great gain. We move forward in our faith. In fact, if you feel stuck right now spiritually, just stop and think about your contentment factor. Just stop and think about that for a moment. It might be one reason you feel stuck right now, is the contentment factor. Start focusing on the greatness of simply being a child of God. Start there. And it doesn't mean God doesn't care about your situation if you feel stuck. It doesn't mean that he doesn't have ideas and purposes for you and ways to help you move through this. But it's more so this. It's not that he doesn't care, it's that he cares so much that he wants you to find the power of contentment in this moment. So if you're stuck, he's not like saying, why, I hope you get out of it because I have great things. He's saying if you're stuck, if you don't learn contentment now, you're not going to get very far in the future. So learn it now while you can. Contentment, godliness with contentment, being a follower of Jesus who also says, I'm content that whether rich or poor, no matter what is for me or against me, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. That's about the contentment to trust God in all situations. And godliness with contentment, now you're moving forward. So our identity in Jesus, it fuels this contentment. And then here's where it gets powerful. Here's what that part does. Number 3, contentment frees us up to lift others up. Contentment frees us up to lift others up. Philippians 2:3-4 says that we are to do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, rather in humility, to value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. See, Jonathan was a child of the king. He was the son of the king, but he wasn't wrapped up in what his kingdom would get him. He was free. And I think that's why he was able to gift his robe and his sword and his bow and all his good stuff to David, is he was free. He was free to. He could give his best to him and lift him up. And I think about me, man, I long to see this in my life. I so want to have the heart that Jonathan did. It's easy to stand up here and talk about these things. It's a lot harder to take the robe off and honor somebody else, isn't it? So see, I'm at the advantage. I sound like I've got it together because I'm on this side of the microphone, right? Like, oh, I'm the guy who's content. And in my contentment, I lift other people up first. But I only will write things that preach to me. And if it helps you to, bonus. But I'm telling you, it's hard when you feel like, but what about me? What about where I'm headed? What about my stuff? You know what's the good news? God takes care of that stuff. He takes care of it. He just asks us not to. He takes care of it. He just says, but you don't have to worry about that. You don't have to worry about that. And so I so long to see this in my life, to truly know who I am in the eyes of Jesus and have this produce a real contentment in me, to not envy others, and then to be freed up to make heroes and kings out of other people. Not to be absorbed with only myself, but to serve the interests of others. In fact, this was the powerful culture of the early church that freaked Rome out. So as Christianity spread in Rome, there was a few things that really freaked Rome out about them. And one of them was their sexual purity. They were radically committed to a different kind of lifestyle. And if you lived in Rome, like, it would really mess you up, because Rome was a very, like, do what you feel, do what you want. And then here was this new group of people who had this fidelity. They also stood and valued life, and that freaked them out. And they also were radically generous. They were radically generous people, and they lifted others up, and they did things and served others so that they could have too. And it just puzzled, but eventually transformed Rome and beyond. It like threw them for this loop, because they were free to generously lift up other people. And one of my favorite instructions I've ever read in the Bible to believers is that we're to rejoice with those who rejoice, and we're to mourn with those who mourn. And when I get this wrong, I envy when others rejoice, and I laugh when others mourn. Like when they're having hard times, I'm like, finally, they've needed that humbling so long. When I see somebody and they're rejoicing, I'm like, man, when am I going to get mine? And in both these things, the heart of God isn't present. Do you remember what that adopting heart of the Father does? It changes us. Where when something is going great, we can say, good, like I'm so actually, honestly happy for you. Not like, I'm so happy for you, right? It's like a real happiness can come up because we're content, because our dad's the king and we're free to make kings out of other people instead of ourselves. We can really rejoice. But then we can also mourn when we see somebody hurting. We can let that same heart that God has break our heart too. We can weep with them. We can try not to bandage it up and make it just all happy. We can say, this stinks. And I'll sit in the mud and say it stinks with you. And we'll pray and we'll hopefully see what God does. But we can really, honestly mourn when people are mourning, and finally rejoice when they're rejoicing. Isn't that what you want? Man, when something good happens in your life, don't you want the people around you to say, yes, finally it's taken so long? And when you're hurting, don't you want people to say, this is terrible, we're with you, we have your back? It's the heart of God and his people to rejoice with those who rejoice. So you have a great opportunity, actually, my friends, and it's this, to make heroes out of others. And sometimes I think, we think about our lives, like think about your legacy. Have you ever thought about that? What you'll leave on this earth, before it's all transformed anyway. But I think about my legacy and like what I'll leave. And if you read my Facebook profile, basically what I'll leave is I like tacos. That's embarrassing. But then I think about, what about the people that know me most? What's the legacy I want to leave? And it's not to build a great big thing or to do some big great thing. I mean, that's great too. I love that. I love big goals, and I love big goals that matter, right? That make a difference. But sometimes a legacy that's most impactful is not how high we climbed, but in whom we lifted high. And if somebody's higher because we helped move them forward, that's a great legacy for any of us. Here's the questions that I'd love to offer for us to reflect on. And worship team, why don't you come back up so that we can wrap up this time together. There's two questions as I encourage you and challenge you to lean into being a content person. The first one is there a situation that you want to chuck a spear in right now? That you can just let go of and put in God's hands? Maybe where envy or jealousy or anger is it's saying, grab that spear and chuck it while you can. And instead, I'm encouraging you to take that and to let go of it and put it in God's hands. And then the second is this, and it's where you'll need to pray and just be open to what God might want to say to you in this moment. And it's, what do I sense Jesus wants to do in my heart today? What do I sense Jesus wants to do in my heart today? And that's a powerful question to ask. And you might not know, but that's why it's good to ask.